In recent years, probably the biggest issue we're facing at the moment is a report that was produced in Australia in March 2015, so only 2 years ago. And that concluded definitively that there's no reliable evidence that homeopathy works. So obviously that made a big story, and there were headlines about that report all around the world. So we were very shocked and surprised by that report because it was conducted by a very well-respected research institute. They're called the National Health and Medical Research Council in Australia. They're government funded and they have a world-class reputation. So when I first heard that they'd done a review of the evidence on homeopathy, I was quite excited by that. I thought, fantastic. Now somebody who knows what they're doing is going to look at this properly and the world is going to know how much good evidence there really is that this works. So when they produced a report that said there's no reliable evidence, I was shocked. So we took a look at this report in detail, and it was very sad to find that they have not treated the evidence on homeopathy the way you would normally do it when you're normally conducting an evidence review. They certainly haven't reviewed the evidence in the same way they normally review evidence on conventional medicine. And this is why they've come up with a negative result. So there are a lot of ways in which it was an unusual report, but to keep it as simple as possible, they invented a rule that they would dismiss the results of all studies that had less than 150 people in them and had a less than exactly perfect quality rating, 5 out of 5 on a rating scale. Now, that rule has never been used before, ever. Not by NHMRC, not by any other research institute in any review. They invented it purely for this study. And when you look at what that did to the evidence on homeopathy, it removed the results of all but 5 studies. So they started with 176 studies. When they applied that rule, they were left with 5 that they said were reliable. And their analysis showed that all of those 5 trials were negative. So that's how they concluded there is no reliable evidence that homeopathy is effective. There were 2 aspects when we investigated this Australian report on homeopathy. One was the purely sort of scientific side of it, exactly how did they treat the data. The other side of it was to look at the procedural aspects. How did they conduct this review? Who did it? How did they do it? And we collaborated with Jerry Dendrinos in Australia, who used the Freedom of Information Act to get hold of files and meeting notes from NHMRC to really dig into exactly how this report was produced. And what he found was shocking to me as a scientist, because he found that they did the report twice and they completely hid the first attempt from the public. They buried it entirely. We would never have known about it. So they did the first review some years ago, and when it was finished, they sacked the contractor and they completely hid its existence. So when we found out about this first review, we asked to see it, obviously, and they are still refusing to this day to release that into the public domain. We asked them, why did you bin this report and why did you hide it? And they said that they refused to accept the first report because it was issues around quality, not the results, the quality of this review. Now, when we're trying to judge whether that's reasonable or not, we have to bear in mind who wrote the first review. And the author of that review is an expert. This author is one of the people who co-wrote NHMRC's own guidelines that tell the rest of the world how to review evidence. So she is an expert. She is highly experienced. She's conducted over 80 reviews, I believe, looking at evidence, all of which have been perfectly acceptable. Then this time, when she reviewed homeopathy, they didn't accept it. They hid that review, they did it all over again. So when people talk about the Australian report that was published in March 2015, what they don't know is that is the second attempt. It's very difficult to know how much we can say about this because we have been told some details about the first review and what it found, but it's not published, it's not in the public domain. So what we can say is it's very interesting when NHMRC have said to us, we didn't reject it because of the results. We rejected it because of the quality of the review. Now, you know, it makes me wonder what that result was. And I really believe if they've got nothing to hide, then show us the first review. Show it to the world and explain to us what's wrong with it. You know, why not? If you can show us why it's poor quality and why you had to bin it, and if you can also explain to us why you hid it, and why you did it all again, then let's hear it. When we were looking at the Australian report, it's really hard actually to believe, for me as a scientist, that a world-class research institute would cook the books, that they would distort the data. I really didn't want to believe that that was possible. The problem is, when you look at this report, you look at what's happened, you look at how it was done and the end result, you can't reach any other conclusion than the fact that they did not treat the evidence fairly or objectively, and it distorted the results. Now, that is scientific misconduct, and we are faced with that fact. So when people refer to the Australian report and say it's a stitch-up job or they manipulated the data, those words are very sensationalist in science. You don't say that lightly, but the problem is it's a hard report to defend, and I really do want NHMRC to come forward and explain themselves. When we were looking at the Australian report, we of course looked to see if there was conflict of interest. Everybody has to look at that first when you're assessing a scientific paper. And what we found is that on the committee that was responsible for conducting this review, the chair originally was a Professor Peter Brooks, and he at the time was a member of Friends of Science in Medicine, which is a very well-known anti-homeopathy lobby group in Australia who've been open about their desire to rid Australia of homeopathy. They're clear about that. So he actually ticked a box on a conflict of interest form that said he was not a member of any organisation that was for or against homeopathy. Now, this was only uncovered through freedom of information. We found that when that conflict was exposed, Professor Brooks stood down as chair of the committee, not for that reason, I think he had lots of other commitments or something, was the official reason, but he stayed on the committee, and the important thing to understand is that committee was very hands-on. They made decisions about exactly how the data was treated, which directly influenced the results. So knowing his opinions on homeopathy, we realised there was the potential for bias. It doesn't prove bias occurred in itself, but it showed that the process was open, potentially to conflict of interest. We also discovered that there wasn't a single expert in either homeopathy or homeopathy research on that committee. Now, that is unprecedented. In all the reviews NHMRC have ever conducted, they have an expert in that subject on the committee for obvious reasons. You have to know what you're looking at to treat it properly. And it's even in their own guidelines that you have to do that. So they broke their guidelines for the first time ever by not having a homeopathy expert on that committee. Each area is different and has different challenges when you research it. So you always have to have experts. And then, of course, you have deliberately people who know nothing about that topic, who bring a different perspective, and you put them together on a committee. First time ever, not one topic expert. So it's been strange from the outset. Unfortunately, we have seen this before. We've seen the evidence on homeopathy being manipulated, not being treated fairly and objectively over and over again. And that saddens me, because I believe in science, I believe in the scientific process, I believe in conducting a study, putting it for peer review. If it's good enough, it gets published in a good journal. If not, it doesn't. I believe in that. And that's not what we've seen with homeopathy. We've seen it being treated unfairly. And there is definitely a prejudice against the science on this topic.